Thank you, guys. That was quite a list of stuff that this talk supposedly covers. We may not get to all of this, but I will do my best. Soup to nuts, actually, the title comes out of the course of the traditional Victorian meal. You know, those huge 14-course things that started with soup and ended in the drawing room with pork and walnuts. But it's become kind of a shorthand for beginning to end, which I thought was sort of a fun title for something that's trying to cover the history of food, which is a huge topic. I blogged for National Geographic on food history and science for about 3 years, which was really fun but super intense. They wanted 2 research articles a week, which was the writer's equivalent of being on a hamster wheel. You know, you never quite catch up. But it was fascinating. So a lot of the stuff for my VHC food talks came out of the National Geographic experience. And, oh, let me show you this.
Whoa.
This is a manuscript on the history of food, which I am hoping to find a publisher for at some point. But it's fun stuff. Lots of good stories in this. So I want you all to cross your fingers for me for that one. So when I started writing for National Geographic, there were 4 of us doing this blog called The Plate. And the first thing they asked each of us to write was a short piece on why is food important to you. And I thought, oh, please. You know, because you'll die without it, right? You know, think the Donner Party, all those shipwrecked sailors who ended up eating their boots. But once I got off of that, I realized that the truth is that food is a huge driving force in history. And there are all kinds of connections to food, which is what makes it so fascinating. So for millennia, food has been driving people to move around the world. And as they move around the world, they've often taken different foods with them. And one of the biggest scramble-ups in food history is this.
Yeah.
The Colombian Exchange, named for Christopher, which has affected all of us. In the Colombian Exchange from the Americas to Europe, when avocados, chocolate, vanilla, tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, peanuts, corn, turkeys. And from Europe to the Americas came cabbages, turnips, lettuce, sheep, cows, and pigs, pears, oranges, peaches, lemons. So it was quite a switch off in the years following Columbus and the other Europeans' arrival in what they called the New World. Now, there's a real downside to this. The downside is Europe also got tobacco and syphilis, and the Americas got crabgrass, starlings, measles, and smallpox. So when you start having these big exchanges, you can't necessarily guarantee what you're getting along the way. The other biggie along these lines was earlier and came via the Silk Road, which is called the Silk Road, but actually it's a whole bunch of roads and routes that stretched about 4,000 miles from China all the way through to Arabia and eventually Europe. And it dates all the way back to the 2nd century BCE. These are old trade routes. And they were really romantic trade routes. These are like camel caravans that were carrying turquoises and pearls and amber, you know, that kind of stuff. But there was also a big food exchange. So into Europe, via these trade routes, came apples, almonds, apricots, peaches, rice, tea, sugarcane. And in the other direction went spinach, rhubarb, onions, cucumbers. And just like there was a downside to the Colombian Exchange, the Silk Roads, Europe also got bubonic plague and gunpowder. So always a switch off. But one of my favorite stories, oh, and this is my 5 minutes of fame. In the course of writing for National Geographic, I was on a National Geographic special called Eat, the History of Food, for which I got to go to New York City and be gorgeously made up. I was spectacular. And they recorded me for 3 hours at answering questions about food. I studied for this thing like it was my PhD oral exam. I was prepared. Well, they boiled this down to 5 minutes on nutmeg. So this is nutmeg. And there's a great nutmeg story that has to do with how food affects world politics, economics, social development, and everything else. Nutmeg comes from Indonesia, and it grows on dioecious evergreen trees. So you have to have a male nutmeg tree and a female nutmeg tree to make nutmeg. And actually this thing is called the harem tree because actually usually on nutmeg plantations it's grown in a ratio of 1 male to 20 females. So, happy trees. So these things, nutmeg, it's like an apricot-like fruit. And it's the only plant that we know that actually produces 2 spices, nutmeg and mace. And mace comes from this little red thing. It's called the aril. It's a seed covering. That's the mace, and then the seed itself is grated up for nutmeg. So Magellan's ships actually introduced this to Europe. Not Magellan, he was dead by then, having been killed in the Philippines, but his ships on the way home loaded up with nutmeg in the Indonesian islands. And Europe, once it got access to nutmeg, went absolutely bats. There was a nutmeg craze like nothing you've ever seen. People put nutmeg on anything you could conceivably put nutmeg on. And nutmeg got a real boost because somebody said that, well, they thought it was a cure for plague, so it became even more popular than it was in the first place. If you were rich, you carried at all times your personal nutmeg grater. And this is one of those. So you could whip it out at any meal and put nutmeg all over everything. So this was very, very popular and very, very profitable. There was a 60,000% markup on nutmeg between Indonesia and Europe. Dock workers were made to wear suits without pockets, so they couldn't possibly pinch any nutmeg. It was kind of like, diamonds nowadays. So the Portuguese did their very best to keep this secret. They faked their navigational charts. Ship captains were made to swear that they would never reveal where they were going under pain of execution. But sooner or later, they were outed. And the Dutch discovered Indonesia and took over from the Portuguese and did horrible things in Indonesia. They slaughtered the islanders, they put workers in concentration camps, and they did their very best to see that no nutmeg left Indonesia that wasn't on a Dutch ship. Well, this was fine except for that. This is the Indonesian island of Rune. It's not very big. It's just a couple miles, I think, across. It's absolutely loaded with nutmeg trees. And it belonged to the British. So the Dutch and the British fought over possession of Rune. And at the end of this conflict, they established a treaty, the Treaty of Breda, in which the Dutch got Rune with its nutmeg trees, and the British got Manhattan. So, you know, that's, I think, a great example of the political impact of food all over nutmeg. Oh, okay. First food, the beginnings of food. Well, for starts, the Paleo Diet idea really annoys me. What we do know is that our Stone Age ancestors did not eat a Paleo diet. The idea of the Paleo Diet dates to about the 1970s, and the idea was that we've still got basically Stone Age bodies, so we're not adapted to modern food. So a lot of modern health problems, you know, cardiac problems, obesity, are all due to the fact that we're not eating the kinds of food that our bodies should be chowing down on. We should eat like hunter-gatherers. So meat, fish, fruit, veggies, eggs, nuts and seeds, but no cereal or cereal products, no legumes, no dairy products, and certainly no sugar, no processed foods, no Twinkies. But the truth is that even if we wanted to, we couldn't possibly eat a Stone Age diet. I mean, look at that huge apple and that fat chicken. I mean, these things did not exist. And when you look at Stone Age versions of vegetables, tomatoes were the size of berries. Potatoes were like peanuts. Corn was a wild grass. There weren't any cobs. It was a wild grass that just had a handful of sort of tooth-cracking kernels at the end of the stem. The only cabbage was sea kale, which was a sort of a bitter, nasty plant that crawled around the seacoast. So the real paleo diets were local, seasonal, and extremely diverse. The guess is based on hunter-gatherer tribes. You know, they probably ate at least 100 different plant species. And depending on where, when, and who you were, anything from grubs to nettles to armadillos. I mean, anything edible. But we do know they prepared it. This is the world's oldest kitchen tool. It came from the Olduvai Gorge. It's 2.6 million years old. And you can read all about it in a book called The History of the World in 100 Objects that was written by a guy whose job I desperately want. He's a curator at the British Museum. And he actually claims to have carved up a chicken with this thing and said it worked very, very well. Cooking. Okay. We know at some point people started cooking, but we don't know just when. These are pieces of the oldest scorched pots in the world. They're 20,000 years old. They come from China, and we found clamshells and snail shells scattered around with the remains of the scorched pots. So the best guess is maybe they were cooking chowder. But campfire cooking is almost certainly way older than cooking in pots. And we don't know how old that is. Making a fire, from scratch calls for some creative technology. The best guess as to how people started using fire was they probably snatched wildfire, already burning sticks, and started a fire that way. But the real problem, archaeologically, it's really hard to identify old fire sites. You know, bones and stones stick around, but ashes just blow downhill. And the oldest known campfire, confirmed campfire, is from this cave. This is the Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, and this dates back about 1 million years. So this wasn't us setting this fire. This was one of our hominid ancestors, Homo erectus. And the reason they're sure that this is a terrible picture of this cave. It's huge. This cave goes back in 150 yards. You know, it's longer than a football field. And they found the remains of this fire, I think about 100 feet in from the entrance, which is why the archaeologists were convinced this was a deliberately set fire. You're not going to get a lightning strike inside a cave. So they could have been cooking or just keeping warm. There's an anthropologist named Richard Wrangham who's done a lot of research on cooking. And his cooking hypothesis is that cooking is what really made us people. Once you could cook something, the nutrients were much more readily available. Starch was gelatinized, proteins were broken down, softens everything up. So you absorbed a lot more nutrients per mouthful. So his idea is that cooking gave us more nutrients, which paved the way for our enormous brains, which have caused us to invent so many creative things. Also, cooking, according to Wrangham, is the source of a whole bunch of anatomical changes. Our teeth and our jaws got smaller. So did our tummies. Our gut size is about a third of what would be expected from a primate of our actual size. So no matter what you think of your tummy, it's little bitty compared to what it could be. Cooking also meant that we didn't have to spend so much time chewing, which is a huge deal for non-cooking creatures. We spend about 5% of our waking hours chewing up our meals. Chimpanzees, who eat wholly raw food, spend 50% of their day just chewing. You can imagine how dull. Another theory is that chimps and other primates who eat entirely raw food have these gigantic muscles, jaw muscles that are anchored on the tops of their heads in a bone ridge called the sagittal crest. And once we were cooking, food was softer. We didn't need these massively powerful jaws. Everything got smaller. We no longer needed these big anchored muscles, which were sort of acting like a girdle around the skull. And so once these were gone, this allowed for skull expansion and bigger brains. Not everybody agrees with this. You know, there's another school of thought that says, no, it wasn't cooking. It was the fact that we could chop stuff up. So we were basically making raw hamburger. One thing, too, that happened, and this might be very recent. This is from the skull of Richard III. Back in 2012, under a parking lot in Leicester, England, they dug up the grave of Richard III. It had not been a parking lot in Richard's time. It was actually an abbey. He was buried in a church, but it had since been paved over. And the archaeologists were really fascinated by Richard's teeth, because his teeth were edge to edge. You can see that. It's like, you know, what we do when we're going, and there's a guy named Charles Brace who studies dentition and the history of dentition. And he says nowadays most of us have an overbite. You know, when you close your mouth, your top teeth are going over your bottom teeth. Well, his theory is that this is a fairly recent mutation. Richard didn't have it, but nowadays most of us do. He thinks this came in because of the use of cutlery. He thinks this mutation occurred maybe 250 years ago, 300, and that it came in with the common use of tools to cut up our food, so we didn't have to grab things and tear with our teeth. He calls this lazy eating, brought on by silverware. The other interesting thing about this, too, is this change in teeth changed language. When you have an edge-to-edge tooth situation, you can't say F's and V's very well. Try it. So you can't say fanfare or vermin very well if you've got an edge-to-edge tooth situation. So Brace's theory is that there was a switch in linguistics right about this time, along with the overbite. I think it's interesting, maybe.
Who's the one on the right? Is that a more modern child?
That's a more modern
Okay.
overbite.
Okay.
So we can't leave chewing without mentioning Horace Fletcher, a food faddist known as the Great Masticator, who came in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and claimed that you could save $500,000 a day nationwide if people would just chew their food. It's actually somewhat true. They've done modern experiments that show people who chew and chew and chew a lot get more nutrients, about twice as many nutrients as people who just gulp it down. But this became known as Fletcherism. People who adopted it were Fletcherizers, and they included Henry James, Franz Kafka, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Teddy Roosevelt, John D. Rockefeller, even Mark Twain gave it a try. The US Army considered enforcing it for troops, saving on money. John Harvey Kellogg adopted it for his patients at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, to the point where he had brought in a string quartet to play a chewing song while people were having their meals to enforce 30 chews per mouthful. And you can find the chewing song on YouTube. It's something like chew, chew, chew. That's all we like to do. Over and over again. Okay, the cooking technique that most connects us to our most distant ancestors, to the Stone Age mammoth hunters, is the luau. This is a cookbook from NPR, who at one point did a series of programs on recipes based on archaeological digs. So this is the Time Traveler's Cookbook. It's got a whole bunch of things like gazelle tartare. But their recipe for mammoth came from a dig in the Czech Republic called Pavlov 6, where they actually found what was essentially the remains of a Stone Age gourmet kitchen. It looked like it had, at one point, had a tent-like covering over it. It had boiling pits, and it had big pits where big chunks of mammoth had been cooked. And it looks like they were put in the pit, hot rocks were dropped on top of them, and then it was covered up and cooked. You know, kind of like a pig roast on a beach in Hawaii. And they know this because they found a whole lot of heat-cracked rocks that were associated with leftover mammoth bones. So they think the luau may have been, possibly one of the older cooking techniques. The closest we probably get to Stone Age cooking today is barbecue, which, interestingly enough, as a cooking technique, as a culinary tradition, and as a word, is still a matter of intense debate. This is William Dampier. The Oxford English Dictionary traces the word barbecue to William Dampier, who was a pirate, though the Encyclopedia Britannica, which clearly is trying to smooth this over, refers to him as a British explorer. But he was a pirate, an author, a scientist, and a passionate foodie. And an interesting guy. He went around the world 3 times and wrote a bestseller. Here it is, Dampier's New Voyage Around the World, which sold like hotcakes and started a rage for travel books that went on for years. He rescued Alexander Selkirk from his desert island, brought him back to England, where he inspired Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe. He wrote the first English description of a zebra. And he ate. He ate his way around the world. And his ship's logs record all his foods. He ate flamingo, he ate armadillo, he ate locusts, which he said were very moist and they would crackle between your teeth. Sea lions, ostrich eggs, Galapagos tortoises, which he actually recorded as tasting like chicken. So he may even have started that. But his logs have what, according to the OED, is the first use in English of the word barbecue. But his barbecue was a bed. He talks about sleeping all night on the barbecue. It was like a sort of primitive army cot-like thing with slats and legs that just got you up off the ground a bit. But then there was a Caribbean word for barbecue that actually did involve the same kind of model thing that you put over a fire to smoke meat, a framework of sticks. And this wasn't new. I mean, the Europeans seeing barbecue would have been familiar with gridiron cooking. That came from Pompeii. Gridiron cooking in Europe dates back to ancient times. St. Lawrence, the martyr St. Lawrence, executed by the Romans in 258 CE, was roasted to death on a gridiron. And bizarrely enough, he is now the patron saint of cooks and comedians. Go figure. And the football field is called a gridiron because of its resemblance to a cooking grill. But barbecue, or the idea of barbecue, is thought to have spread from the Caribbean to the American South, where roasting up a couple of hogs became a standard for a party weekend in the pre-Civil War South. And the Civil War South. Remember at the beginning of Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara, wearing that disgraceful dress that showed her shoulders in the morning, was off to a barbecue at the Wilkes Plantation. And they were a real favorite for political events because then, as now, there's nothing like free food for bringing out the vote. This is the Capitol building in Andrew Jackson's time. And he planted a grove of barbecue trees specifically to have White House barbecues. And according to what I read, these are the trees. In Jackson's day, you had to have a wood fire for a barbecue. Nowadays, it's all charcoal briquettes or gas grills. But charcoal briquettes we owe to Henry Ford. He was a multi-dimensional man. Henry Ford, in the early 1900s, had a camping group called the Vagabonds. And with his best buddies, who included Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, John Burroughs, and assorted US presidents, would go on annual camping trips in their Ford cars. And they toured the Everglades. They went up and down the California coast. through the Great Smokies. They came to Vermont. They went through Vermont at one point. And this was not camping like you and I know camping. They had monogrammed individual tents. They traveled with a chef, a dining room table with a Lazy Susan. This was luxury dining. A stove went along with them. China. At one point, they had waiters with bow ties. But at one point, they were going through Michigan, and Ford identified some timberland that he wanted to buy to provide wood for his Model Ts, which took a lot of wood. So he hired a real estate agent named Edward Kingsford to follow through on the deal to buy this forest land. Well, he gets his sawmill up and running, but Ford was very thrifty. And he was really concerned about all the wood scraps and the sawdust and stuff that was left over from his sawmill. So he told Kingsford to come up with something. So Kingsford got in touch with an Oregon chemist. And the two of them came up with an idea to make these biscuit-sized lumps called charcoal briquettes out of sawdust, glue, cornstarch, some kind of binder. They didn't go over all that great right at first. They were picked up by smokehouses. I mean, this was before the age of everybody has an outdoor grill. But Ford came up with the idea of selling them as picnic kits. So you would get a little box of charcoal briquettes, and you would get a little grill, and you could take this in your Model T Ford on day trips for picnics. The only time that barbecue really didn't take off until this thing came along. And this was invented just post-World War II by a guy named George Stephen, who was a welder and worked for the Weber Brothers Metal Company that made buoys for the Coast Guard. And he got the idea of cutting a buoy in half, putting a cap and legs on it, and turning it into a backyard barbecue grill. And he called it George's Barbecue Kettle. His neighbors made fun of it and called it Sputnik. Well, the Weber Company subsequently took over George's barbecue kettles and started producing them as Weber grills. So nowadays, about 75% of American families have a barbecue grill, and chances are it's a Weber, but it should be George's barbecue kettle. Or Sputnik. Oh, just very quick. This is another reason that cooking was such a plus. This is a very abbreviated form of the Maillard reaction. Cooking doesn't just soften stuff up. It makes stuff really delicious because of this browning reaction, which happens when sugars and proteins interact at high heat. And it's why roasted coffee beans are good, and dark chocolate, and Guinness stout, and grilled steak. It's all the Maillard reaction. These are named after the French chemist who discovered it in the early 1900s. And there are now entire scientific conferences that talk about this thing, because this will give you 600 different products or more. This is a complex reaction. And it's why those little bottles of stuff that you buy at, like Kitchen Bouquet or browning sauces really don't work, because they don't duplicate the real thing. It's hard to fake. So once we stopped chasing mammoths, we started farming. Agriculture came in at the tail end of the Ice Age, and most people now agree that it's probably the worst idea we ever had. And we had it in a lot of places. I mean, I remember when I was in school, this right here was the cradle of civilization, the beginning of everything. But actually, agriculture was invented in lots of different places as the Ice Age came to a close. And why it occurred in these places and not in others is generally thought to be because there are a lot of plants and animals that can't be domesticated. You know, you didn't get much in Australia. You had eucalyptus and kangaroos. I mean, they were, you know, poor bets for farming. What most scientists agree on farming, which, you know, Vermont, it sounds so pleasant. Well, it wasn't a better diet. The cereals that people were raising, early barley and wheat, were poor in minerals and vitamins, and they're really hard on the teeth. And we were all made for lounging around on the savannah and climbing trees and chasing gazelles, not for hoeing things and carting buckets. So it's about this time people got shorter and skeletons start showing a lot of abuse. You know, people were starting to have arthritis and slipped discs. There was more disease because people were living close to their animals. More violence because if you'd gone to the trouble to plant a field, you really didn't want anybody else to move in on your field. Less free time. The problem with it is that it helped the species. It would support a lot more people than hunting and gathering. So we kind of did ourselves in there, because once you had all these people that were supported by farming, you had to keep farming to support all these people. But farming is another reason to forget the paleo diet, because farming triggered a lot of changes in the human genome, and one of them has to do with salivary amylase, which is the enzyme that converts starch into sugar. If you hold a cracker in your mouth for a long time until it becomes soggy and disgusting, it will eventually start tasting kind of sweet because your salivary amylase has broken down the starch in the cracker. Well, the more copies of the amylase gene you've got, the more of this enzyme you make in your saliva. Most primates, chimpanzees, gorillas, have 2 copies of the gene for salivary amylase. Human beings have 6. And this evolved along with the high-starch diets that came in with farming. And that didn't just change us, it changed our best friends. Dogs. Dogs, who by that time were domesticated and were eating high-starch table scraps, also developed multiple copies of salivary amylase genes. So dogs these days have like 8 copies of this gene, whereas their wild relatives like wolves and coyotes have just 2 copies. So lots of amylase came in with farming. The other thing that came in is the ability to drink milk with our cookies, which is called lactase persistence. Lactase is the enzyme that breaks down lactose, which is the main sugar in milk, and babies have tons of it because they're living on milk. Usually, it's gone by the time you're 7 or so. In theory, you're supposed to give up milk. If you don't have lactase in your system and you try to eat dairy products, I mean, even yummy ones like Ben & Jerry's, it causes a whole bunch of gastric miseries, upset stomachs, diarrhea. Ugh. Well, a mutation in the gene that codes for the lactase enzyme started showing up at about the same time we started having herd animals. So milk by then became a survival plus. If you had milk available year-round, it was a great food source. And so there was a lot of pressure for you to be able to digest this stuff. So lactase persistence, the gene, the lactase would be turned on throughout your life, came in. It's common among people of European ancestry, where there was a lot of herding, some regions of Africa and the Middle East, some areas of Asia. But to this day, it was associated with the development of herding. Dairy farming. Today, about 35% of the world is has lactase persistence. But, well, we're on butter wars. We have to talk about butter. We don't know who invented butter. One theory is that it came from Eurasian nomads, the ancestors of Genghis Khan, who carried mare's milk in skin bags on their journeys across the steppes. And, you know, the shaking up of this stuff on horseback would eventually churn the milk into butter. There's an alternative that says it was Arabs and it was on loping camels, but it was pretty much the same thing. So we don't know where we got butter exactly, but we do know where we got margarine. Margarine came from a French chemist named Hippolyte Mege-Mouriez. And in 1869, he developed a cheap substitute for butter out of beef tallow, which he called oleomargarine, or maybe oleomargarine. It reached the US almost immediately afterwards, and within almost no time, we had 37 companies making margarine, and the dairy farmers went bats. They protested it on the grounds of it threatened the family farm, it was destroying the American way of life, and the entire moral order was going to fall because of margarine. This is one of the political cartoons from that era, which shows everything from rubber boots to dead dogs going into margarine, whereas butter comes from the sweet-scented farm and is absolutely pure. And where they really had problems with the margarine was over color. Margarine was white. It looked like wallpaper paste. So the margarine manufacturers wanted to tint it yellow so it would look more appealing. And the dairy farmers did not want them to tint it yellow so it would look more appealing. And in fact, by 1902, 32 different states had color restrictions laws on margarine. Vermont, New Hampshire, and South Dakota ordered margarine by law to be colored pink. Other states had margarine, it had to be red, brown, black even. You can imagine how that would look on toast. These laws were eventually overturned by the Supreme Court, who said you can't by law force somebody to adulterate a food. But possibly in Vermont's honor, these were known as the pink laws. Margarine had a real uptick in the Depression because it was cheap, and through World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt helped it along because she said she ate margarine on her toast. But the yellow ban persisted for a long time. It wasn't lifted in Wisconsin until 1967. But the way people got around this was by selling margarine in a bag. So you got a bag of white, ugly margarine, and you got a capsule of yellow dye, and you squished it together, and you got a yellow margarine that looked like butter. And that is the story of margarine. Margarine's on the outs these days, and butter is back in, because it looks like nutritionally the trans fats in margarine are worse for us than the saturated fats in butter. What have we got here? Ooh. The benefits of family dinners. They're supposedly huge. They've done a lot of psychological studies on families that eat together and have found that they are psychologically more healthy. They have stronger family bonds. Their children have better manners and larger vocabularies. So eating together is a good idea, though most American families don't manage much of it anymore. In fact, we eat a lot of meals in our cars. Let's see. Oh. So where did we come up with the idea of breakfast, lunch, and dinner? This really came in with the Industrial Revolution. I mean, just because we were raised with it doesn't, now it's pretty much worldwide, but it wasn't always the case. In Tudor England, for example, they had 2 meals a day, one at 10 in the morning and one at 4 in the afternoon. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the big meal tended to be dinner in the middle of the day. But after a lot of people started going out and working in offices, in factories, they didn't come home in the middle of the day. So dinner gradually shifted toward the evening, and people at work ate lunch. Lunch was pretty much a 19th century invention. They think the word came from an Anglo-Saxon word, nuncheon, which meant a chunk of food that you could hold in your hand, like a sandwich. Now, sandwiches, on the other hand, not lunch, but sandwiches, date to the 18th century and are named for this guy, who is John Montagu, the Earl of Sandwich. And there are a couple of stories about him. One was that he was an inveterate gambler and was having, at one point, such a run of luck that he didn't want to leave the gaming table. So he told his cook to bring him something that he could eat with one hand. And he got meat between 2 pieces of bread. The other is that he was a very hard government worker and didn't want to leave his desk. So pick one. But people started ordering the same as sandwich, and gradually this food, something between 2 pieces of bread, became known as the sandwich. We eat 45 billion sandwiches a year collectively. The sandwich really was not invented by the Earl of Sandwich. You know, the idea of having a chunk of bread and something else with it is ancient. That goes way back. But it wasn't called a sandwich. It was called bread and cheese, or bread and meat. And really what the Earl of Sandwich popularized was a pre-made sandwich, where you didn't have to put it together yourself. The Victorians added a 4th meal, tea. There it is in all its glory, supposedly invented by one of Queen Victoria's ladies, who said around 4 o'clock in the afternoon she suffered from a sinking feeling and needed a snack. So food. Food isn't just about when and what you eat, it's also how you eat it. And all societies have these rituals that go around dinner and how you eat your meals. And this hasn't always been great. Table manners from time immemorial have been used as weapons to show that you were really superior to that guy at the other end of the table who is using the wrong fork to eat his fish. Seating arrangements are a big deal. You know, if you've got the head of the table, you're probably the most important person in the room. And in the colonial era, the most important person not only got the head of the table, but got the chair. And sometimes these chairs were great chairs. In the colonial era, a lot of people didn't have chairs. About a third, one study showed that only about a third of people in 17th century Virginia had chairs or benches. Often there was only one chair, and the man of the family got it, and the women and children ate standing up. Many families didn't have a table. When you did, chances were it was a board that leaned up against the wall and then was set up on trestles when you were ready to have your meal. And all of these distinctions survive to the present day. You know, the chairman of the board harks back to who got the chair at dinner and what he or she was eating off of. A boarding house is offering you food. Room and board means room and a meal, harking back to the colonial board. So social status also had to do with this thing. This is the Benvenuto Cellini salt. And back in the medieval period, salts were phenomenal. This thing is about yay big. It's solid gold. It has a sea god and an earth goddess. He's got salt in a little container, and this little temple in the front has pepper in it. And this thing was planted in the middle of the medieval table. If you sat above it, you were socially important, and if you sat below it, you were not socially important. But you could do a lot with social status by trying to downgrade it, which is where round tables came in. The idea of the round table was that there was no head of the table. Legendarily, King Arthur's round table was all about equality among his knights. And depending on who you read, the round table seated either 25 knights or 1,600 knights. This table was made in the 13th century, and it's in Winchester Castle, hanging on the wall. And it's supposedly a replica of King Arthur's table. King Henry VIII had it repainted during his reign, and this is why King Arthur looks remarkably like King Henry VIII. But a round table in America has long been a symbol of equality. So a round table discussion is one where everybody gets an equal say. Round table conferences. So round tables are a big deal. So in terms of etiquette and table manners, a lot of problems came in with this thing. The fork. Knives and spoons are ancient, but forks are relatively new. The very earliest we know date to the 11th century, and they look pretty much like this. They were two-pronged, and rich people had them, so they were often solid gold. We've got an early story about a Byzantine princess who married the son of the Doge of Venice sometime around this 11th century period, and brought with her a fork. And she died shortly thereafter and was accused by the local bishop of suffering from excessive delicacy in eating, which is what did her in. So for centuries, nobody liked the forks. Everybody made tremendous fun of them, except the Italians, because they were great for pasta. They weren't really common in America until the late 1700s. We know Washington and Jefferson had sets of forks. But forks were still being avoided up into the 1800s. A lot of people ate with spoons and knives. But they weren't nearly the problem that they were about to be, because the fork really became a disaster, etiquette-wise, when a new way of serving dinner came in. The common practice in the Middle Ages was to serve dinner in a way that was called French-style service, which meant you put everything on the table at the same time. So tables were loaded. The more food you had on the table, the more impressive you were. George Washington served dinner like this. His famous Thursday dinners had maybe 2 courses of 30 dishes apiece, and all of these were on the table at the same time. This was replaced in the 19th century by Russian-style service, which was, think Downton Abbey. This is where you don't have food on the table. And food is served in successive courses, ideally brought in by footmen. And these are where we start getting these very elaborate Victorian meals, 14 courses, soup to nuts. But along with this Russian-style multi-course service came bazillions of kinds of cutlery. So you had knives, forks, and spoons for every conceivable kind of food. You had bouillon, cream soup, and aspic soup spoons. You had tea and coffee spoons. You had egg spoons, grapefruit spoons, marrow spoons, melon spoons. You had egg spoons that were made out of mother of pearl so that the metal wouldn't be stained by egg yolk. You had lobster forks, fruit forks, salad forks, ice cream forks, strawberry forks, snail forks. To say nothing of bonbon scoops, asparagus tongs, chocolate muddlers, grape scissors. Look at that thing. That is a Saratoga chip server. Potato chips. So with this came what came to be known as fork anxiety, because you could have a million forks on the table and nobody knew which one to use for what when. There was a lot more to it than that. You could also have, an array of 7 different glasses on the table, variously for your white wine, red wine, water, sherry, and you had to differentiate among these. But Miss Manners, do you remember Judith Martin? Loved Judith Martin. She used to write a column for the Washington Post. She said, forget fork anxiety. If you use the wrong one, just lick it and put it back down, and nobody will notice. Oh, I found this interesting. This is how much does it matter what we eat? How important is diet to longevity? Henry Ford was convinced that carrots were the secret to long life. But what's actually true is a good chunk of long lifespan is due to genetics, maybe up to 30%. So if all your grandparents live to be 95, you've got some good genes going on there. The rest is all about environment and lifestyle. So location, social interactions, physical activity, and diet will all contribute to this. And supposedly all of these factors come together perfectly in these zones called blue zones. And this is a map of the blue zones: the Greek island of Icaria, Sardinia in Italy, Okinawa, Japan, Loma Linda, California, Nicoya, Costa Rica. So immediately researchers zeroed in these places and said, who's eating what here? Well, it turns out, for example, that the Icarians eat a lot of beans, 6 times more beans than the average American. They eat fish, olive oil, veggies, not much sugar, average of 3 cups of coffee a day, and 2 to 4 glasses of wine. So they actually sound quite fun. So I looked up a whole list of people who have had unusually long lifespans to see what they ate. So the Delaney Sisters, who wrote a New York Times bestseller called Having Our Say back some years ago, they lived respectively to be 109 and 104 years old. And they said they attributed their long lifespan to yoga, cod liver oil, and garlic. Pearl Cantrill of Texas, who died at 105, said it was all due to bacon. Britain's oldest citizen, a guy named Ralph Tarrant, who lived to be 110, said it was whiskey and cottage pie. But my favorite is Jean Kellman. Do I have a picture of her? This is the oldest verified human being. Jean lived to be 122 and remembered as a kid meeting Vincent van Gogh. She didn't think much of him. She thought he was rude. But she attributed her old age to port, cigarettes, 2 pounds of chocolate a day, and young men.
2 pounds.
That's a lot of chocolate. I've got tons of other stuff.
Go ahead.
But keep going. What else do I have here? Oh, that's where some of my food research comes from is this book, which is a history of garden vegetables. This was picked up by the military book club, which I've always thought was interesting. I wonder if they actually knew what they were getting. I mean, I do talk about war at certain points in this book, but I wouldn't have picked it for the military book club. That is portable soup. Where are my notes on portable soup? Portable soup was terrible. There was a lot of attempts to invent ways of preserving food early on. If you had a lot of food, you had to do something with it other than just let it spoil. Probably one of the earliest things people did was just let it dry in the sun. You probably made something like beef jerky fairly early on. But things became more complex later. And one of these was portable soup, which was made by cooking beef broth until it formed a sort of jelly, skimming the jelly off and putting it between paper and letting it dry. And then supposedly this was great for shipboard. A lot of stuff went on shipboard that was sort of awful experiments. And this, you can see, it's actually stamped with the King's Broad Arrow, which shows that it was used for the Navy. There's a scene in the Master and Commander series of books that has the ship's doctor flinging portable soup into the ocean. Captain Cook took some with him on his round-the-world voyages and ended up having to flog people to make them eat it. Other people said that it wasn't so bad. You're starving on a long journey, you just put a little under your tongue and you get kind of a lift. But portable soup was never really successful. The Lewis and Clark expedition, which really didn't take much food with them. They took salt, maybe some spices, but they were really planning to survive by trading and hunting along the way. The one thing they did take was 100 pounds of portable soup. So there's a point in Lewis and Clark's expedition, hunting had been very poor. It was quite a big group, plus they had a number of Native Americans along with them. They didn't have anything but one pheasant. So Lewis and Clark cracked out the portable soup, and the expeditioners took one taste and decided to kill and roast one of the horses.
Oh, wow.
So you can tell that was not successful. What else do I have pictures of? Cutting ice. This was actually a whole series on the history of etiquette books, which were kind of cool. The oldest one that we have comes from ancient Egypt, and it really boiled all of etiquette down to couple of fairly simple principles, which were eat what's on your plate and don't stare at the host. Chocolate. Chocolate comes from the cacao tree, which is a really weird tree. Has anyone seen one? The cacao pods are about the size of orange footballs, and they grow right out of the trunk. They're really strange looking. Chocolate was known as early as 1900 BCE by the Olmecs in Central America, who fermented, roasted, and ground beans, made them into a paste, mixed it with water and vanilla, honey, and chili peppers. It was thought to be a mood enhancer and an aphrodisiac. Practically everything food-wise has been an aphrodisiac at one time or another. Our word chocolate comes from the Aztec. The Spaniards, the conquistadors, once they ran into it, hated it. They thought it was disgusting. They described it as a bitter drink for pigs. But it really took off once somebody had the idea of mixing it with cane sugar. And in fact, it became so popular and so many people were drinking it during church services that the church banned it. Said, enough with the chocolate. Chocolate is really complicated. It contains at least 600 different chemical compounds. It's 3 times more complex than red wine, which is complicated too. And it's complicated to get it just right. The cocoa butter, which is the fat in chocolate, it's polymorphic. It's kind of the chemical equivalent of a split personality. So depending on temperature, you can end up with one of 6 different kinds of cocoa butter. And only one of them, cocoa butter number 5, is the cocoa butter you want for good chocolate. So this temperature-controlled process is called tempering. So you have to melt it and cool it until you get your chocolate just right. Chocolate, we may be looking at a chocolate shortage, which of course should concern all who love chocolate. It only grows within a 20-degree band of the equator, which is called the 2020 zone, and it's really susceptible to disease. I mean, it's wiped out entire countries' worth of chocolate plantations due to various diseases. So a lot of people have been working very hard to breed a disease-resistant chocolate. The problem with it is that chocolate is a really slow grower. So it takes at least 5 years to produce fruit and 10 before it's clear that this tree is producing chocolate that anybody would want to eat. There's a lot of not so good chocolate. There's a variety that's called CCN51 that was produced in Ecuador. That's a very, very productive chocolate plant. And then people were thrilled to death with this. Wow, it makes a lot of chocolate, but it turns out that it doesn't taste very good. So this is a problem for the people who make these wonderful artisanal chocolates. You know, it's not going to get very far in Paris. Do you have any questions? You know I can blab on forever, so you know you're going to...
I hope you'll come back.
Oh, I'd love to.
Oh.
How did turkeys get their name?
Oh, turkeys are a mess. Turkeys are North American. They had been domesticated in Mexico very, very early on. There were tens of thousands of turkeys running around Mexico when the Spaniards arrived. But turkeys became very confusing for 2 main reasons. One was the Portuguese, who were pains in the bottom about trade, didn't want anybody to know where they were going with their trade. So they would go pick things up in India, then they would scoot over to North America and pick more things up, then they would go back to Europe, by which time nobody knew where anything had come from. So the turkey was referred to as the bird of India, the Calcutta hen. It was also mixed up with the African guinea fowl, so, which it sort of vaguely looks like. You know, they're two odd-looking birds. The Spaniards at one point thought it was part peacock. So it was known as galapavo, which is chicken peacock. So there were just a tremendous amount of confusion about where it came from and who you ended up with calling your turkey, which does not come from Turkey, was just kind of luck of the draw as to what stuck. But they're not from Turkey, they're from here. In fact, we've got a big flock that's been wandering around us up home with little ones. I thought it's kind of late in the year to have little bitty turkeys. But lemonade. Lemonade?
Sure.
Oh, God. I'm so sorry. Lemonade. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff on lemonade. It originated in Egypt in the 11th century, where it was a mix of lemon juice and sugar. And it spread to Europe by the 1600s or so. There were lemonade sellers on the streets of Paris at that time, who basically went around carrying lemonade in barrels on their backs and would fill cups for passersby. There's one guy who theorizes that Paris actually escaped the worst of the plague that came through in the 1600s due to lemons. That so many lemons were sold in Paris that trash heaps were full of lemon rinds. Lemon rinds were sort of an organic insecticide. So the rats who were living in the Paris trash heaps and eating lemons were relatively flealess compared to rats in other non-lemonade heavy cities, so the Parisians escaped the worst of the plague. I don't know, but it's a great story, isn't it? There's also some wonderful stuff about lemons and invisible ink. Invisible ink, I read a wonderful book on the history of invisible ink. It's been around since at least the 5th century BCE. The warring Greeks and Persians were sending messages written in invisible ink. And we've got recipes for this stuff from the Renaissance, which used lemon juice as an invisible ink, also onion juice. There's also one that's a little doubtful about extracting juices from a dormouse, which are supposedly invisible by day but glow with a fiery color at night. But the lemon juice works because on paper, it's acidic, so it breaks down the paper fibers. So when you warm it up, the broken down areas will brown first. So that's how you'll see. Lemon juice invisible ink was used in the American Revolution, in the Civil War, in World Wars I and II. In Britain, there were a series of guys known as the lemon juice spies who were apprehended in 1915. They were caught funneling info written in lemon to politicians and military leaders back home. And one of the lemons, you can still see it, it's in the British National Archives. It's all shriveled up, it's about the size of a walnut. But it was one of the lemon juice spies' lemons. You have to love it.
So what's the name of your new book? Was it 12 courses that you were?
It's 12 courses. It doesn't have a publisher yet.
But I mean, we'll be looking for that on the library shelves.
Oh, God, I hope so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Parents want the Trojan War, by the way, we do have, it's just currently checked out.
Oh, that's good, though.
Yes. Yes. I looked for it this morning, I'm like, no, somebody checked it out, so, yay.
Oh, but yes, I have a copy. This is what it looks like.
All right.
See, I have little Greek soldiers. Now, it's a great title, but honestly, I have to tell you, How Carrots Won the Trojan War is a very suspect story. Supposedly, when the Greek soldiers were walled up inside the Trojan horse, waiting to be dragged into Troy and to destroy the city. They ate carrots, and the quote was, to bind their bowels, because presumably the Trojan horse would be a terrible place for bathroom breaks. That's really all I've got on it. I do know that boiled carrots were supposedly aphrodisiacs and were supposed to break down the inhibitions of female captives. So there was also a story that went that the Greeks would feed their female captives mashed boiled carrots to turn them into party animal women. The actual carrot, as far as I know, does none of these things. But there's a lot of stories in food history. So, carrots, keep it in mind.
Maybe they took the carrots before they got into the horse to clean them out.
That would make sense, but I don't think carrots give you constipation. Yeah, I'd love to do a book on fruit. Carrots reminded me of prunes, which were,
Last time you were here, you were already talking about some fruits, and I brought you a jar of, not for you because it's already open, but eggplant jam.
ooh, how's that? Is it good?
It doesn't have a pronounced flavor because, it's got a lot of sugar in it, but it's got, sort of candied eggplant in it, and it's not, no, it's a jam.
What does it look like?
It's not, it's
Ooh.
not American.
Oh, it's pretty.
Huh. Where is it from? Like Turkey or something?
I think so. It is, I think it was Turkey. Yeah,
Well, it's a
Turkey.
hot
Turkey, that sounds like,
Middle Eastern
yeah. Interesting.
fruit.
Do you like it?
I wouldn't get it again. I would try making it myself before I bought it again, and I would probably want to make it more of like a eggplant butter instead,
Okay.
because it's got tons of sugar in it.
I could see it as a Christmas gift.
So I got that in California because Middle Eastern stores have it.
Neat.
Interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've got a whole bunch of stuff in the veggie talk about what constitutes a vegetable and what constitutes a fruit, and how botanically it's pretty straightforward, but politically it's all over the place.
And the other thing is, can you say anything about milk products? Because now they're finding, you're getting into genetics, but they're finding out that there's a A2 milk that's better for people because a lot of people don't have the enzymes to break down the lactose.
I didn't have anything in this presentation on milk, but I did a whole bunch of milk research for this book. I don't remember that, but I'll go look it up.
It's really,
I've got a couple books on milk. Yeah, the literature of food is phenomenal. I mean, you name a food and somebody's written an entire book on it.
Great.
Thank you for coming.